An elderly black man appears in court for unpaid fines, expecting fairness, but instead faces humiliation from the judge, who mocks his struggles in front of the courtroom. However, when the man makes a simple phone call, everything changes. His daughter, a powerful federal judge, is on the other end. The judge's arrogance crumbles as he realizes his mistake, and the courtroom falls silent before the fines are dismissed instantly. In the aftermath, an investigation exposes the judge's history of discrimination, leading to his downfall, while the elderly man walks away with his dignity intact, proving that true power lies in integrity, not status. The courtroom buzzed, with quiet murmurs as cases moved swiftly, one after another. An elderly black man, dressed in a simple but neat suit, stepped forward with quiet dignity. His name was called, and he approached the bench expecting a fair hearing. Instead, he was met with sarcasm and humiliation. The judge, Robert Hensley, leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk, his lips curling into a smirk. His cold, piercing eyes scanned the man before him, his voice laced with condescension. "So, Mr. Carter," Judge Hensley began, flipping through the case file, "you mean to tell me you can't afford a few parking fines? At your age, I'd think you'd have figured out how to handle your money." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Joseph Carter, standing tall despite his weathered hands and the weight of his years, remained silent. He had seen men like this before, men who thrived on power and belittling others. He had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. The judge wasn't done. "Let me guess," he continued, shaking his head. "Another excuse? Medical, bills, struggling with money, Social Security checks not stretching far enough." His tone dripped with mock sympathy. "Isn't it funny how people always find a way to get themselves into trouble, but never a way to get out of it?" The courtroom murmured, some whispering to each other, others looking down uncomfortably. Joseph inhaled slowly, controlling his emotions. He would not be broken down in front of an audience. Then, with calm certainty, he spoke. "Your Honor, may I make a phone call?" Judge Hensley raised an eyebrow, smirking. "And who exactly do you need to call? Someone to wire you a couple of dollars?" More chuckles spread through the room. Joseph simply pulled out his old flip phone, dialed a number, and waited. He spoke softly into the receiver, then, without another word, held the phone out to the bailiff. "She'd like to speak with you," he said politely. The judge rolled his eyes but took the phone, holding it to his ear lazily. "And who am I speaking to?" he asked, still amused. The moment the voice on the other end responded, everything changed. Judge Hensley's expression froze. The color drained from his face. His grip on the phone tightened slightly, and he sat up straighter, his confidence wavering. The entire courtroom, once filled with low murmurs and chuckles, sensed the shift. Something was happening. The judge swallowed hard, nodding slightly as the voice on the other end spoke with calm authority. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time that day, he was speechless. The bailiff took a step forward, eyes narrowing. "Your Honor, is everything all right?" Judge Hensley quickly cleared his throat and forced a tight smile, but the arrogance was gone. Yes, of course," he stammered, nodding quickly. He turned his gaze back to Joseph, his entire demeanor different. The smirk had disappeared. The superiority had drained away. The judge set the phone down carefully before glancing at the bailiff. "Dismiss the fines," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had just moments before. A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. People exchanged stunned looks. Someone muttered, "Wait, what just happened?" Another person leaned forward, whispering to their neighbor, "Did you see his face? He looked terrified." Joseph Carter remained exactly where he stood, his face unreadable. He simply nodded once, his dignity intact. Judge Hensley hesitated, gripping his gavel as if it was the only thing keeping him steady. His hands, so confident, just moments ago, were now trembling. He looked at Joseph for a long moment, then forced an awkward chuckle. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding," he said, though no one in the courtroom believed him. The truth was clear. The voice on the phone had belonged to Joseph's daughter, and she wasn't just anyone. She was a respected federal judge. As Joseph turned to leave, a young woman sitting nearby leaned toward a fellow spectator. "He could have been anyone," she whispered, shaking her head. "Yeah," the other person replied, still staring at the judge's pale face. But Hensley only saw what he wanted to see. The municipal courtroom was a place of routine judgments, where cases moved quickly and defendants were little more than names on a docket. The atmosphere was cold and impersonal, the walls lined with stiff wooden benches where people waited for their turn before the judge. Some spectators watched with mild curiosity, while others sat with indifference, scrolling through their phones or staring blankly ahead. The air carried a sense of inevitability. Most people who walked through those doors already knew what their fate would be. Seated in the front row, Joseph Carter, a 72-year-old retired factory worker, waited for his name to be called. His posture was upright, steady, despite the weight of years resting on his shoulders. His hands, rough and calloused from a lifetime of labor, rested on his lap. He had come to court over unpaid parking fines, an issue that should have been minor, yet had somehow led him here. Money was tight. His small pension barely covered rent, medical bills, and groceries. But Joseph was a man of pride and quiet dignity. He had never been one to ask for handouts, nor did he believe in making excuses. He had every intention of paying what he owed. He just needed time. As the clerk called his name, Joseph rose, adjusting his modest but neatly pressed coat before walking to the defendant's podium. His steps were steady but careful, the aches in his knees reminding him of decades spent working long shifts, standing for hours in assembly lines, his body enduring the wear and tear of time. He knew better than to expect sympathy here, but he refused to let this moment take away his dignity. At the judge's bench, Judge Robert Hensley barely glanced up from the file in front of him. A man in his mid-60s, sharp-featured and with an air of self-importance, he was well known in legal circles for his rigid, no-nonsense approach to justice. But there was more to it than that. Hensley had a reputation, a man who enjoyed the power of his position, a man who thrived on belittling those who stood before him. His sharp, dismissive tone had reduced many defendants to stammering apologies, empty excuses, or quiet resignation. Joseph's case seemed to amuse him. Judge Hensley tapped his pen against the desk, barely containing a smirk as he skimmed the details of the file. He had seen hundreds of cases just like this, an elderly man living on fixed income, unable to keep up with the system, now looking for leniency. To Hensley, it was all too predictable. He didn't see Joseph Carter, the hard-working man who had spent his life contributing to society. He only saw another defendant who had failed to take responsibility. Joseph could feel it already. He wasn't going to be treated fairly today, but he stood his ground, his back straight, his expression calm. He had lived long enough to know that men like Judge Hensley fed off power, and while Joseph didn't have power, he had something else: patience. And before this hearing was over, he knew that patience would teach the judge a lesson he'd never forget. The courtroom was filled with quiet murmurs as Joseph Carter stood at the defendant's podium. The air was thick with indifference, the usual rhythm of justice moving swiftly, without much thought or care for those who stood before the judge. Judge Robert Hensley barely concealed his amusement as he looked down at the elderly man in front of him, flipping lazily through his case file. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the wooden bench. "Mr. Carter, you mean to tell me you can't afford a few simple parking fines?" His voice carried across the courtroom, dripping with mockery and disbelief. His sharp gaze flickered over Joseph's worn suit, his tired but dignified posture. "At your age, I'd think you'd have figured out how to handle your money by now." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Some spectators shifted in their seats, sensing the unfairness of it, but no one spoke. Joseph remained calm, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I am on a fixed income. After my medical expenses, I barely have enough for rent and food." He spoke with quiet dignity. Not pleading, just stating the truth. Judge Hensley snorted, shaking his head. "Medical expenses, rent, food, excuses, excuses." He waved a dismissive hand. "Maybe if you had worked harder in your younger years, you wouldn't be in this position now." The words hung in the air like a slap. Joseph inhaled slowly, gripping the wooden podium in front of him. The room felt smaller now, the weight of the judge's condescension pressing down on him. One of the clerks at the side of the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in her chair. A woman sitting in the back row let out a barely audible, disapproving sigh. The cruelty in the judge's words was clear. Joseph, however, didn't react. He had faced hard men, cruel men, arrogant men, all his life. This one was no different. What mattered was how he handled it. Taking a deep breath, he spoke in the same calm, unwavering tone. "Your Honor, may I make a phone call?" Judge Hensley's eyebrows shot up, surprised at the request. Then a smirk curled at the edge of his lips. "A phone call?" He laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. The people in the courtroom watched closely now, intrigued by the shift in the moment. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "And who exactly do you think is going to save you?" More soft chuckles. Joseph said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out an old flip phone, and dialed a number. He brought the phone to his ear, spoke briefly, then without another word, turned to the bailiff and handed it over. "She wants to speak with you," he said, his voice steady, almost unreadable. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly amused but also slightly intrigued. He reached for the phone, still smirking, and then everything changed. Judge Hensley took the phone from the bailiff, still wearing a smug expression as he lifted it to his ear. His tone was dismissive, as if the call was nothing more than an inconvenience. "This is Judge Robert Hensley," he said lazily, barely masking his disinterest. But the moment the voice on the other end responded, everything changed. The smirk vanished from his face. His posture straightened, his fingers tightening around the phone as his eyes flickered with something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. A tense silence settled over the courtroom as spectators watched, sensing that something was happening. The arrogance that had radiated from Hensley moments ago seemed to shrink, replaced by an almost imperceptible stiffness in his shoulders. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, his voice suddenly careful, almost strained. "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered, the words barely above a whisper. The room, which had been filled with quiet murmurs and occasional chuckles at Joseph Carter's expense, was now eerily still. The shift in power was palpable. People exchanged looks, some leaning toward each other, whispering in hushed tones. "Did he just call someone else? Your Honor?" one person murmured. Another spectator smirked and whispered, "Oh, this just got interesting." Even the bailiff, who had been standing motionless watching the exchange, now looked between Hensley and Joseph with curiosity. The judge's hand gripped the edge of his bench as if trying to ground himself. He nodded quickly, listening intently as the voice on the phone continued. His fingers twitched slightly, his usual air of dominance evaporating by the second. "No, of course not," he said hurriedly, his voice lacking the confidence it carried just moments ago. "I was simply following protocol." The words felt hollow, and the courtroom knew it. More whispers rippled through the crowd, quiet laughter barely suppressed. His eyes darted toward Joseph, but the elderly man remained perfectly composed, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply waited. Judge Hensley quickly turned away, his forehead slightly damp with sweat. "Yes, Your Honor, I completely understand. Judicial ethics must always be upheld." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and another chuckle could be heard from the back of the room. He gave a tight nod, muttering another hurried, "Of course," before carefully, almost nervously, handing the phone back to the bailiff. The judge then turned his attention to Joseph, his face carefully composed, but the confidence he had before was gone. "Well, Mr. Carter," he started, clearing his throat, "it appears there has been a misunderstanding." His voice, now tight with forced politeness, sounded nothing like the overconfident mocking tone he had used earlier. The tension in the room deepened as everyone listened, hanging on to his words. "Given the circumstances," he continued, shifting in his seat, "I see no reason to continue with this case." A pause followed, the weight of his admission settling over the courtroom. "Your fines will be dismissed immediately." The words echoed in the space, and for the first time since stepping up to the bench, Joseph allowed himself a small smile. The judge, however, wasted no time in grabbing his gavel and slamming it down. "Case dismissed," he announced quickly, as if trying to move on before the moment could drag on any longer. But it was too late. The damage was done. The once stiff atmosphere of the courtroom now buzzed with quiet conversations. Those who had laughed at Joseph before now watched him with something different in their eyes. Not pity, but respect. Others simply marveled at what had just unfolded. The judge, who had thrived on belittling those he saw as beneath him, had been humbled in front of an entire courtroom, and he knew it. The moment Judge Hensley dismissed the case, the courtroom returned to its usual rhythm. But something had shifted. The arrogance he carried so effortlessly had crumbled in an instant. The man who thrived on belittling others had been exposed, and though the hearing was over, the consequences of his actions were only beginning. Word of what had happened spread quickly. Court clerks, attorneys, and even a few spectators who had witnessed the exchange whispered about it in hushed tones. Some recounted the way Hensley's expression had changed. Others spoke of the name on the other end of the phone, Judge Maya Carter, a federal judge with influence far beyond this small courtroom. The whispers didn't stop at the courthouse doors. Within days, the story had reached the ears of higher authorities. An internal review of Hensley's judicial conduct was launched. At first, it was just a formality, a quiet attempt to smooth over the public embarrassment. But as investigators began combing through his past rulings, something troubling emerged. A pattern. Dozens of complaints had been filed against him over the years. Allegations of racial bias, excessive fines, demeaning comments toward black and lower-income defendants. Time and time again, his decisions had disproportionately punished those who lacked the resources to fight back. Many had walked away humiliated, burdened by fines they couldn't afford, while others had lost opportunities because of his harsh sentencing. Yet, because of his reputation and tenure, every complaint had been buried, dismissed, or ignored. Not anymore. With a federal judge now paying attention, the state judiciary had no choice but to act. Attorneys and former defendants began coming forward, their voices gaining momentum. Cases that had once been seen as isolated incidents were now part of a larger pattern of abuse. Hensley tried to fight back, insisting that his rulings had always been by the book and that he had never been anything but fair. But the weight of the evidence was too overwhelming. Court transcripts showed his condescending remarks, and multiple defendants testified about their experiences of being belittled and unfairly penalized. The backlash was swift and merciless. Facing public disgrace and the threat of formal removal, Hensley was forced into early retirement. What should have been a respected exit after years of service had become a scandalous downfall. The man who once held the gavel with absolute confidence now left the courtroom a disgraced figure, his legacy permanently stained. Joseph Carter, however, walked away with his dignity intact. He had never sought revenge, never raised his voice, never fought back with anger. He had simply stood his ground, spoken his truth, and let the weight of justice tip in his favor. As he stepped out of the courthouse, a light breeze brushed against his face. The city moved around him as it always had, bustling, indifferent, but something felt different. He had come here expecting to be dismissed, mocked, just another name on a long list of cases. Instead, he had stood tall, and the man who sought to humiliate him had been brought to his knees. The fallout from the courtroom incident spread far beyond its walls. What had started as a routine hearing over unpaid fines had become a story that people couldn't stop talking about. Within days, news outlets picked up the case. The headlines varied. Some focused on Judge Hensley's downfall, while others highlighted Joseph Carter's quiet but powerful defiance. Local reporters dug deeper, uncovering more about Hensley's history of bias and misconduct. Former defendants stepped forward to share their experiences, and what was once whispered about in hushed tones became public knowledge. The judicial system could no longer ignore what had been happening under its watch. In response to the growing backlash, the court announced immediate reforms. New policies were put in place to review cases for bias, ensure fair sentencing, and prevent judges from wielding unchecked authority over vulnerable defendants. Training programs were introduced to educate court staff on racial bias and ethical conduct. The legal community, shaken by how easily the abuse of power had gone unnoticed for so long, was forced to confront its own flaws. Most notably, a new judge was appointed to replace Hensley, one who publicly promised fair treatment for all, regardless of race or financial status. The shift was subtle but significant. People entering that courtroom would no longer fear the humiliation that had become Hensley's signature style. Through all of this, Joseph Carter remained the same. He never sought revenge, never demanded an apology, never gave a grand speech about justice. He simply continued his life as he always had, quietly, with dignity. However, something had changed. Where people once looked at him with pity, they now looked at him with respect. The man who had stood before a judge and refused to be stripped of his dignity had left an impact, not just on those in the courtroom that day, but on countless others who heard his story. One afternoon, as Joseph sat on a park bench reading his newspaper, a young public defender approached him. She had been in the courtroom that day, a quiet observer among many, and she had watched everything unfold. She hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Carter?" Joseph folded his newspaper neatly, glancing up with a warm but questioning look. "I just wanted to say," she continued, shifting slightly, "I don't think I could have handled that like you did. If it were me, I think I would have argued, fought back, maybe even lost my temper. But you stayed calm. You never raised your voice, and somehow you still won." Joseph studied her for a moment before offering a small, knowing smile. "Patience," he said, "teaches people more than anger ever will." The young lawyer nodded, his words settling deep within her. She had spent years learning the law, understanding how to fight battles in court, but Joseph had just taught her something that no textbook ever could. As she walked away, Joseph turned back to his newspaper, content, knowing that justice had found its way, just not in the way the judge had expected. Dignity speaks louder than power. In a world where people use their status to belittle others, Joseph Carter proved that true strength lies in patience and self-respect. Without raising his voice, without fighting back with anger, he turned the tables on a judge who thought he was untouchable. In the end, it wasn't power that won. It was dignity. Would you have stayed as calm as Joseph did? Have you ever witnessed injustice in court, or seen someone be mistreated because of their circumstances? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your experiences. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful, real-life inspired story. These are the moments that remind us all of the importance of fairness, justice, and standing tall even in the face of humiliation. Stay tuned for another unforgettable story next time. You won't want to miss it.